Students, greetings. So today's screencast is all about ATP. Now, ATP is a molecule that you theoretically learned about last year in biology. Hopefully, you remember a little bit about that. You may recall that it is used for energy, and in this class, it has come up already. So take a moment, think back to our last class, and think about what was the role of ATP in muscle contraction. It played a role in that sliding filament theory, that sliding of filaments. What did it do? Do you remember? Here's a hint. You may recall that ATP is what is needed for the myosin head to release that actin filament. So ATP plays a central role in the sliding filament. So as those little myosin heads grab onto the thin filaments and slide them, ATP is central to that. So today we're going to look at how does a cell actually make ATP? And so here's a picture of ATP. It stands for adenosine triphosphate. This complicated looking part of the molecule here is the adenosine part. And then the triphosphate refers to these three phosphate groups that are on the end. And in order to make ATP, you have to start with something called ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So ADP has two phosphate groups, and you need to use energy, usually from glucose or some other sugar or fat. You need to use energy to add that third phosphate group onto there. So there's different ways that your body does this under different circumstances, and that's what we're going to look at. So, and actually you read about these already in that reading that you did. So the first method for generating ATP is a molecule called phosphocreatine. And phosphocreatine, what it does is it directly transfers a phosphate group to ADP to make ATP. So if you take a look, here you have this molecule phosphocreatine, and if you just kind of ignore this big chunk on the right, notice that there's a phosphate group on the end. And so what phosphocreatine can do is it can just transfer that phosphate to ADP and make ATP. And when it does that, all that's left is this big chunk on the right, and that's what we call creatine. And then later on, we can use other ATP to kind of replenish our supply of phosphocreatine. So this table is something that you have in your study guide, and it's the very last page of that study guide, and so you're welcome to fill this table in from that, or you could just copy it down directly into a notebook. But I'm going to fill this table to compare these three different methods of making ATP. So phosphocreatine, how does it produce ATP? Well, it directly transfers that phosphate to ADP to make ATP. This is used for initial bursts of activity, like that initial boom. So for example, if I'm standing in the front of the classroom teaching and the fire alarm goes off, I know from past experience that I need to get out of the building fast before the hallways become all crowded with students who get in my way. So I need to go from just standing still to like a boom sprint in like a second. And so that initial burst of activity is where phosphocreatine comes in. So if you're a sprinter, the start where you kick off and start sprinting, that would be phosphocreatine. How fast is it made? Super fast. Super duper fast. It's just one chemical reaction, so this goes like that. How long can it produce ATP? Only 5 to 7 seconds. And that's the bummer about this. It can give you energy really quickly, but you're done in 5 to 7 seconds. So if this was my only system, I'd be out of energy in 5 to 7 seconds. Now, I can run super fast. That would still get me really far, but still not ideal. Is it aerobic or anaerobic? These are terms that hopefully you remember from biology. Aerobic means it requires oxygen. Anaerobic means it does not require oxygen. Phosphocreatine does not require oxygen. It is anaerobic. It occurs in the sarcoplasm or the cytoplasm of the cell. And how much energy is produced? 1 per phosphocreatine. That's not a lot. So it doesn't make a lot of energy, and it's used up pretty quick. But there's no waste products. Yes, you get creatine when you're done, but that can be recycled, so that's not a problem. Now, some of you may be thinking, like, don't athletes like take creatine at some point? And it is a thing. If you go to GNC, General Nutrition Center, what you'll find is they're closed because of coronavirus. But if you went when there wasn't a pandemic, you could find this powder, and you can buy it. And here's just a picture of me back in my creatine using days. The jury's still out on the effectiveness of this. I'm no expert, but I've had students who really defend creatine. The idea is if you have more creatine in your system, then you can have more energy for those initial bursts, and therefore can push a little harder, work a little bit more, and get more muscle mass. In reality, it seems like a lot of the increased muscle mass you see is actually from water moving into the cells because creatine is in there. It's an osmosis thing, if you remember that from bio. And so you're actually adding a lot of water mass to your muscles. So it makes them look bigger, but they're not necessarily stronger. The other big thing to be aware of is creatine is really hard on your kidneys. And so people who take creatine are told you need to drink a ton of water, like a crazy amount of water, to make sure you flush it from your system safely. So, if that's something that you're thinking about, interested in exploring, make sure you're reading the directions really carefully and using it appropriately. So, but it is a legal supplement. Second technique for creating ATP is glycolysis and fermentation. So glycolysis is a 10-step biochemical pathway. It's just a series of 10 chemical reactions. You don't need to look at this in much detail. If you're in AP Bio, you really dive deep into this. But other than that, no, you don't need to know all this. The idea is glucose is slowly broken down into something called phosphate. So the way it produces ATP is it partially breaks down glucose and releases some ATP. This is used for sprints. So a sprint could be where you're in a sport and your coach says, go run as fast as you can across the gym or across the field. That is a sprint. But it also could be more generally, if you're just on a long run and all of a sudden you hit a hill and you have to push extra hard to get up that hill, that could be a sprint. If you are just walking down the hallway and all of a sudden you got to get up the stairs, that could be considered a sprint. So just kind of that little extra oomph that you have while you're exercising. How fast is it made? Fast. Not super fast, but fast. How long can it produce ATP? Up to 5 minutes. So it's a little bit slower than phosphocreatine, but it lasts a little bit longer. It is still anaerobic, so you don't need oxygen to do this. And where in the cell does it occur? It occurs in the sarcoplasm, just like before. You get 2 ATP per glucose, which isn't a huge amount, but it's something. And you do get a waste product, which is lactic acid. Lactic acid has long been sort of blamed for muscle soreness. In reality, we now know that the muscle soreness is because of swelling of the muscles due to little, microscopic tears in your muscle cells that can happen when you exercise really hard. And then that swelling pushes it up against nerves and causes pain. Lactic acid doesn't actually cause the pain, but it is a waste product and your body does have to deal with it. The third method for making ATP is called cellular respiration. This is a much more elaborate process. It begins with glycolysis, so we're still converting glucose to that pyruvate that I mentioned. But then that pyruvate enters what's called the citric acid cycle. Sometimes it's called the Krebs cycle. And then something called the electron transport chain follows. Again, if you're in AP Bio, you get to dive into this in lots of detail. It's very cool. But for our purposes, we're not going to worry about the details too much. All you need to know is it's a complicated biochemical process. So how does it produce ATP? Well, in this case, we completely break down the glucose. And that releases lots of ATP. So glycolysis partially breaks it down to release some. This completely breaks it down to release a lot. This is used for endurance. So it could be a long distance bike ride. It could be a long, slow jog. Or it could just be, walking to class or sitting in class. You're actually using endurance to sit in a chair and hold your head up and write on a paper. I mean, that's kind of endurance too. How fast is it made? Slow. Um, we have to, phosphocreatine was one chemical reaction. Glycolysis was 10. This is those 10 chemical reactions plus another, 8 or 9 for the Krebs cycle, plus that whole electron transport chain thing. It takes a lot longer. It's slow. But how long can it produce ATP? Indefinitely. As long as you have fuel and one other molecule, you can keep going. And guess what? You always have fuel. As long as there is flesh on your bones, you have fuel. And so then you might think, well, why do we ever get tired if we have fuel indefinitely? Well, the reason we get tired is because this process is aerobic. You need oxygen. And the thing that slows you down is that your body is unable to deliver oxygen to your muscles to keep up with demand. And you know this is happening when you start to breathe heavily. If you are gasping for air, that means your muscles are no longer aerobic, which means you can't do cellular respiration anymore. And that means your body has shifted to glycolysis and fermentation. And so that's why you get tired and you eventually have to stop when you're gasping for air. It's because without oxygen effectively delivered to your muscle cells, this process can't happen. You shift to this process, glycolysis and fermentation, and that can only last up to 5 minutes. So once you start gasping for air, you either need to slow down or stop, or eventually collapse, I guess, is an option. This occurs in the mitochondria, the ever-famous powerhouse of the cell. That's why it's called the powerhouse, because it's making this ATP. And it makes 30 ATP per glucose, which is a lot more than these other two options. Waste products, CO2, and you get rid of this waste product every day, every moment when you exhale. You're actually breathing out CO2. In fact, crazy to think that the only reason why you have lungs is so you can take in the oxygen for this aerobic process and get rid of the CO2 that's a waste product. That is why you breathe, is to exchange those gases to support this process. And as you know, you don't live long if you're not breathing, which highlights the importance of this process to your body's function. So note that at any given moment, you are probably using a combination of all three of these activities. And so here's just a graph of exercise duration versus what percent each system is. So this refers to the phosphocreatine system. Aerobic is cellular respiration. And you can see when you first start exercising, the phosphocreatine is the number one, and then it drops off quite dramatically. Glycolysis slowly kicks in pretty quickly and carries you for a while, and then aerobic takes a while to get going, but then that really is what dominates as you continue going. And note that this is in seconds, so this is up to 5 minutes here. But even after 5 minutes, you're still using all three systems to some extent. Here's another kind of interesting little graphic that compares aerobic, which is cellular respiration, versus anaerobic in males and females as they do different events in track. So from 100 meters, which is really short, it's mostly anaerobic. All the way down to 3,000 meters, which is mostly endurance, it's mostly aerobic. But you can see that you're using both systems in every event to a limited extent. So I'm going to pause the video there and we'll pick up with part 2. And we're going to talk about, well, what does this have to do with meat? Because it does. And we'll get to that in a moment.